In the hush of the Grand Assembly, where trillions of sentient beings convened under vaulted stars, he stood alone. A single human, clad in matte black combat armor etched with scars no other civilization could decipher, his silhouette stark against the luminous dais of the council. The chamber pulsed with the slow, rhythmic breath of the Concord's central intelligence, a vast organic computation that monitored all proceedings. Even in the ambient glow of knowledge and supposed enlightenment, the human's eyes were unflinching. It was as if he carried within him the memory of every storm that had ever broken across the savage face of Earth dot around him. The Concord's high counselors, arrayed in semicircular tiers of crystalline thrones, shifted with uneasy disdain. A dozen species, each older than humanity by millennia, each convinced of their own benevolence and wisdom. The Alseer of Kethel, a being of flowing silver membranes, lifted a limb in a gesture of polite dismissal. "Deathworlder," it intoned, its voice resonant with layered harmonics. "Your petition for recognition is noted, but you must understand your species remains unrefined, prone to conflict. It is for the greater stability of the galaxy that your seat is denied." Whispers slithered across the tiers like cold drafts. The word Deathworlder carried a particular bite, an ancient label meant to categorize life born on planets so hostile that the very air was a hazard. The Concord had long believed such species were driven by desperation rather than reason. From their perspective, humanity was a crude offshoot of violent potential, best monitored from a safe distance. That Earth had reached for the stars was an inconvenience. That humans had survived against the Concord's covert attempts to strangle their expansion was an insult. The human inclined his head as though considering a response. His name was Commander Elias Kale of the Terran Vanguard, though no counselor bothered to address him by title. They believed titles were a formality wasted on upstarts. They believed many things. Kale's voice, when it came, was low and steady, carrying across the amphitheater without amplification. "Your stability," he said, each word falling like a stone into deep water, "is built on the assumption that no one will ever stand up to you." Some of the counselors recoiled, their bioluminescent mantles flickering in discomfort. A soft chime sounded etiquette violation. Kale ignored it. The Alseer lifted its limb again, signaling to the adjudicators along the chamber's perimeter. They moved toward him, tall, insectal creatures armed with force suppressor pikes designed to subdue any physiology. As they approached, Kale's gaze swept the chamber, noting every expression of disdain, every flash of pity. To them, he thought, it was simply procedure. Deny a seat. Quell the inevitable protests. Disarm the savage. Return to their debates on trade routes and resource allocations. They would never admit that humanity had become a variable in their calculations, an anomaly that refused to be contained. His hand drifted to the hilt of his sidearm. The adjudicators tensed, antennae flattening, but Kale only rested his fingers there. A reminder to them, and to himself, that restraint did not mean weakness. That their assumptions were nothing more than a thin veneer of control over a reality they refused to see. "You presume that your moral authority is universal," Kale continued, his voice softer now, almost sorrowful. "That your ancient codes can dictate the future of a species you've never bothered to understand." The counselor of the Sand Collective, a six-eyed being with glistening blue chitin, clicked its mandibles in annoyance. "Your capacity for aggression is precisely why you cannot be trusted. You burn everything you touch. Even your homeworld is a testament to chaos." Kale lifted his gaze to the grand dome overhead. Through it, the stars blazed a tapestry of cold, relentless possibility. Somewhere out there, the Terran Vanguard was waiting, watching. He felt the invisible tether linking him to every outpost, every hidden fleet humanity had painstakingly built beyond the Concord's reach. The Council believed they had mapped every human stronghold. They believed Earth's entire strategic value could be measured by the planets they had cataloged. But there were so many things they hadn't cataloged. So many truths they had chosen not to see. Perhaps, Kale said, letting the word linger in the stillness, you should ask yourselves why a species born to endure extinction after extinction would ever be content to kneel. For the first time, the chamber fell into true silence. Even the adjudicators hesitated. In that hush, something shifted. A glimmer of unease passed among the concorders, a brief awareness that this solitary figure, denied a seat, was not simply a petitioner, but a harbinger. Not a barbarian, but an emissary of a civilization that had survived every cataclysm nature could conjure. The Elseer's membrane shivered in what might have been the closest its kind came to apprehension. You speak as if your species has any hope of resisting the Concord. Kale smiled, then an expression that did not reach his eyes. You think denial is the end of this conversation. And though none in the chamber realized it, that was the first moment they began to understand how completely they had underestimated humanity. Outside the Grand Assembly, the Concord's fleets shimmered against the darkness, an armada of elegant dreadnoughts and spireship carriers arrayed in perfect formations. To the untrained observer, it looked like an impenetrable wall of civilization's might. Polished hulls etched with glyphs thousands of years old, engines the size of cities, weapon arrays that could scour a planet's surface in minutes. To the Concord, these displays were reassurance. Proof that, no matter how belligerent the Deathworlders became, technology and tradition would prevail. In the days following Commander Kale's removal from the chamber, a steady trickle of intelligence came in from scout detachments and diplomatic observers posted around human space. The reports were read, dismissed, and archived. Small anomalies that hardly merited the attention of the Council's strategists. A trading station near Proxima Centauri went dark. A relay buoy in the Perseus arm broadcast a garbled distress signal before going silent. On the fringe of the Orion Spur, a Concord survey team failed to check in at their appointed interval. Minor incidents, the analysts insisted. Statistical noise. Yet as the hours passed, the pattern of disappearances began to stretch like hairline. Cracks through the polished confidence of the Concord hierarchy. High Admiral Vorhill of the Elseer's fleet convened a closed briefing aboard the dreadnought Illuminant Purpose, its halls lined with living walls that pulsed in response to his steps. His command staff representatives of 12 species waited. With expressions carefully arranged in professional calm, Vorthil's thorax twitched as he activated the holodable, projecting a map of human-settled space. Red sigils glowed where contact had been lost. We are to maintain public statements that these interruptions are the result of mechanical failure, he rasped, his voice carrying the oily cadence of someone reciting policy he no longer believed. Privately, however, the possibility of coordinated sabotage cannot be discounted. A Calvary strategist, all translucent flesh and luminous organ clusters, rippled with irritation. How could primitives from a Deathworld orchestrate simultaneous strikes across such distances? Their logistical capacity is orders of magnitude beneath ours. Vorthill did not answer immediately. Instead, he flicked the limb across the table, enlarging a single report, an intercepted human transmission from the vanished trading station. The audio was warped by static, but a single sentence emerged clear as a blade drawn across glass. We see you watching, and we are not afraid. A silence descended over the command dais. For a few heartbeats, no one spoke. Finally, the San Intelligence Director shifted her many limbs, mandibles ticking in agitation. If this is a psychological operation, it is unsophisticated. Bluster, typical of untempered species. Perhaps, Vorhill allowed, though his compound eyes stayed locked on the recording. Yet I find it curious they have targeted only observation platforms and relay buoys. Not a single civilian freighter has been attacked. No settlements have been bombarded. This is not an offensive, they are blinding us. Several of the staff emitted startled clicks. To wage a campaign aimed solely at information disruption required planning years of planning. That implication rippled outward like a contagion, infecting the comfortable assumptions that had protected the Concorde's pride for generations. In the days that followed, the first elements of the Concorde's expeditionary armada began deployment along the periphery of human territories. Behemoth spire ships glided into position at Lagrange points, their sensor arrays unfurling like the petals of colossal flowers. Tens of thousands of warriors in polished exosuits stood ready to occupy human colonies, confident that once humanity saw the overwhelming display of force, their resistance would evaporate. On Earth itself, in the hidden bunkers beneath the old mountain ranges, the Terran vanguard watched the alien fleets assemble. Kale's image flickered on a dozen screens, his calm expression unchanging as reports came in from their forward cells. "They're still convinced this is a show of dominance," Kale observed, voice devoid of triumph. "No incursions. Number. Preemptive bombardments. They believe they have time to prepare a surrender ceremony." Across the command center, his officers shared tight, grim smiles. The Concorde had spent millennia crafting an aura of inevitability, an empire whose main weapon was the belief that resistance was futile before it ever began. That belief had worked against hundreds of younger civilizations. But humanity was not young in the ways that mattered. They were old in hardship, old in endurance, and old in the certainty that no power, no matter how ancient, was beyond challenge. As the Armada arrayed itself, the first evidence of deeper miscalculations began to emerge. A Concorde scout corvette investigating the vanished relay buoy found. No wreckage, only a perfectly clean orbital path, as though the massive station had never existed. An hour after the corvette's last transmission, it too disappeared from sensors, leaving behind a blank space in the grid. At a communications hub near Alpha Lyrae, automated warning systems tripped without any clear cause. When the technicians arrived to investigate, they found every databank and archive intact, but every backup, every redundant copy had been erased to the molecular level. And then there was the message, short, ominous. "You will learn the difference between observation and understanding." High Admiral Vortal stood alone in his quarters that night, contemplating the darkness beyond the viewport. A part of him, some vestigial instinct, whispered that they were no longer the observers in this contest. They were the observed. And that was the first sign something was deeply, fatally wrong. The first undeniable blow fell in the quiet hours before the Concorde's next scheduled strategy session. Aboard the Illuminant Purpose, the flagship's command dais thrummed with low-frequency harmonics as encrypted data streamed in from 100 relay beacons. Dozens of officers clustered around the holodable, murmuring over projections of sensor sweeps and logistical manifests. The air smelled faintly of ozone static discharge from the spire ship's enormous coms, arrays adjusting their orientation to track human targets. High Admiral Vortal surveyed the busy chamber, his four eyes sweeping across the data columns. Everything seemed normal, orderly, inevitable. Even the scout losses were within expected attrition parameters. Then the ship's consciousness spoke, a disembodied voice resonating from every surface. Unscheduled transmission detected. It announced. Encryption, Concorde Standard, High Command Clearance. Origin unverified. Vorthal's chitin tightened across his thorax. "Display," he ordered, gesturing with one limb. The holodable rippled, lines of alien script flickering into view. For an instant, it looked like an ordinary logistical update. Then the letters blurred, shifted, rearranged themselves into perfect, clear Terran Standard. "We see you." The lights in the command dais dimmed. Every console's interface dissolved into the same two words. Officers gasped and recoiled from their stations. An alarm shrilled, an intrusion alert, meant for the most catastrophic breaches. "Shut it down!" Vortal barked, his voice edged with a fear he did not bother to conceal. "Purge all connections, sever links to the fleet." But it was too late. Around them, the dreadnought systems began to stutter. Overload warnings cascaded through the air in pulsing red glyphs. Automated defenses went offline. The sensor pedals outside the hull folded in on themselves like dying flowers. Even the environmental stabilizers, a redundant, isolated system, flickered. With error codes, someone whispered the name then, half superstition, half plea. The Null Choir. The name spread in terrified murmurs. The Null Choir was a legend. A rumored human project so audacious the Concord's intelligence community had dismissed it as disinformation. An infiltration system designed not merely to penetrate enemy networks, but to consume them, to overwrite every protocol, every safeguard, every last scrap of digital certainty. The lights snapped back to full brightness. For a single, impossibly silent moment, the chamber looked normal again. Then the holodable flickered and filled with a new image, a live feed. Commander Elias Kale stood in a featureless compartment, helmet off, dark eyes fixed on the camera. His expression was calm, almost weary. "Hi, Admiral Vorthill," he said, voice carrying across every speaker aboard the Illuminant Purpose. "By the time you hear this, you will have lost contact with over 60% of your forward surveillance. Your ships are not destroyed. They have simply been removed from the board." The officers gaped in frozen horror. Some tried to shut the projection down, but their consoles refused to respond. "You've believed all these years that your reach was infinite," Kale continued. "That no civilization could build faster or think faster than you. You were wrong. The Null Choir has been resident inside your datanet for nearly 2 decades, learning your rhythms, your protocols, your blind spots, watching, waiting." Vorthill found his voice, though it felt thin in his throat. "Your sabotage will not deter us. We have the numbers." Kale's eyes sharpened. "This isn't sabotage. This is the first step." He lifted a hand in a small final gesture. The feed went black. Instantly, alarms erupted in a deafening chorus. Across the fleet, ships vanished from the tactical grid, entire formations dropping offline as if they'd never existed. An adjutant shrieked, "We've lost 32 dreadnoughts, no transponders, no distress signals." Vorthill lurched toward the primary console, clawed limbs slamming futilely into unresponsive controls. Every backup routine, every failsafe, had been subverted. It was impossible. It was happening. Aboard the thousands of Concord ships arrayed around human space, the Null Choir activated its second phase. Systems went dark. Artificial gravity failed. Targeting arrays scrambled their own coordinates. Crews drifted in sudden, catastrophic silence as the networks that governed every process turned against them. Within an hour, the proudest fleet in the galaxy was blind, paralyzed, and leaderless. And the worst was yet to come. When the news reached the Grand Assembly, the chamber erupted in chaos. Counselors shouted over one another in a dozen languages. Some demanded immediate retaliation. Others wailed that they should sue for peace before humanity escalated further. The Alseer, its membranes now dull with shock, struggled to comprehend what it had witnessed. All their centuries of measured superiority had not prepared them for this. Far from primitive, the Deathworlders had anticipated their every move. They had studied the Concord's strengths and turned them into vulnerabilities. At the heart of the assembly, in the same place he had stood before, Commander Kale's vacant seat loomed like an accusation. No one dared approach it now. And in the minds of every counselor, the same realization took shape, slow and terrible. They had made a grave mistake. Panic swept across the galaxy in the hours after the Null Choir's revelation. At first, the Concord's leaders tried to reassert control by sheer force of habit. Emergency councils convened on every major world. Spire ships limped into fallback. positions, their crews working by hand to rebuild crippled systems. Commanders issued contradictory orders, convinced they could overwhelm human ingenuity with brute numbers alone, but each attempt to rally dissolved into frustration. Fleet elements that hadn't been compromised by the null choir were forced to rely on antique analog protocols secure, but so agonizingly slow that coordination was nearly impossible. On every front, something went wrong. At Cygnus Gate, a Concorde relief flotilla tried to establish a staging area to reassert surveillance. When their transports arrived, they found orbital docks already stripped bare. Entire warehouses of munitions and provisions were missing. No alarms had sounded. No ships had been seen departing. In the Perseus Arm, a coalition of San and Kelvary dreadnoughts regrouped at a classified rendezvous point only to discover that the coordinates had been leaked. When they powered up their drives, waiting human hunter-killer craft cloaked among them, delivering precision strikes that severed propulsion cores and left the massive ships drifting. Helpless. And always came the messages broadcast in perfect Concorde standard, delivered to every frequency their species used. We are still here. We are watching. We are not afraid. The psychological toll was worse than any battlefield loss. Concorde strategists were forced to confront a truth their ancestors had always denied. Humans thrived in conditions that would break any other civilization. Every setback, every escalation only seemed to make them more determined. In the Grand Assembly's crisis chambers, the Alcir tried to project calm. Its membranes rippled with studied serenity as it addressed the other counselors. Their sabotage has been substantial. It intoned, but they remain numerically inferior. If we re-establish secure communications and press an offensive, the Terran vanguard cannot. It stopped. A new image had appeared on the central dais. Orbital footage from a deep space Concorde surveillance array. Hundreds of ships were emerging from slipstream transit ships that did not match any known Terran configuration. Their hulls were rough, repurposed freighters armored with scavenged alloys and bristling with weapons. Yet every transponder identified them with the same origin. Independent human colonies the Concorde had long written off as failed settlements. Kale's voice spoke over the feed. Did you truly believe Earth was alone? The chamber erupted in shouts as the implications settled like cold iron in every mind. For generations, the Concorde had told itself that humanity was fragmented, too divided to pose a real threat. That their old colonial diasporas, left to struggle on inhospitable worlds, would never find common cause. But the Terran vanguard had spent decades building alliances in the dark, forging trade routes invisible to the Concorde's scrying eyes. These were not isolated holdouts. They were reinforcements. In the hours that followed, the invasion the Concorde had planned became a grim, grinding struggle for survival. At Epsilon Prime, Concorde forces attempted a full-scale assault on a Vanguard logistics hub, a sprawl of hardened bunkers beneath a shattered moon. Expecting the disorganized militia, the attackers found layered defense grids, orbital artillery, and swarms of autonomous drones that tore through their formations with horrifying efficiency. At the Battle of Kepler Verge, a Concorde carrier group tried to use brute force to overwhelm a coalition fleet of repurposed colony ships. The humans countered with tactics that no Concorde tactician had ever modeled, weaponizing the carrier's own maintenance protocols, seeding their targeting arrays with falsified friend or foe signals, turning their gunnery crews against each other. And everywhere the Concorde struck, they found traps waiting. Booby-trapped mining stations rigged to detonate under boarding parties, false distress beacons that lured warships into ambushes, viral AI that hijacked reconnaissance drones and turned their own observations into disinformation. Vorthill, now operating from a battered spire ship near Delta Sagittarius, watched the collapse unfold with something close to disbelief. He'd spent centuries studying the great campaigns of Concorde history, Wars of conquest that ended in submission after a single decisive blow. No adversary had ever waged this kind of war, not a contest of annihilation, but of exhaustion, deception, and psychological pressure. Humans did not simply fight. They adapted so quickly that the Concorde's most advanced predictive models fell apart. They anticipated countermeasures before the Concorde even formulated them. And beneath every operation, every withdrawal and feint, was the unshakable sense that humanity was not merely reacting. They were executing a plan no Concorde mind could fully grasp. On Earth, in the hidden bunkers beneath the old mountains, Cale watched the latest reports with steady composure. Status? He asked. 72% of their forward elements are isolated, his adjutant replied. We estimate they'll attempt fallback consolidation within the week. Cale's gaze flicked over the constellation of red sigils marking crippled fleets. Prepare the second phase, he said quietly, and issue the transmission. A transmission that would soon ripple across every Concorde frequency. You believed. Your strength lay in your unity. Ours lies in our refusal to be broken. And though the Concorde commanders clung to the belief that they could still prevail, many felt a chill they could not name. They had assumed the Deathworlders would break beneath the weight of the Concorde's power. Instead, humanity was only growing stronger. The Concorde's last illusions of control died in a single, harrowing hour. It began with an emergency conclave aboard the dreadnought Illuminant Purpose. High Admiral Vorthill stood at the apex of the war chamber, surrounded by Hala simulacra of commanders from every Concorde sector. Their faces scaled, chitinous, feathered, reflected the same hunted desperation. We must converge our remaining fleets, Vorthill declared, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. If we regroup at the Cygnus lattice, we can re-establish command coherence and launch a decisive. The feed fractured into a burst of static. Half the commanders vanished. Red error glyphs pulsed in their place. Signal interruption, an aide stammered. Source unknown, but Vorthill already knew. Across the chamber, every display winked out. Then a new image resolved in perfect clarity. It was Earth seen from orbit, oceans glinting blue under the sun. A single transmission began to play. You have underestimated not only our resolve, but our alliances. As the words echoed, the Concorde's deep space sensor arrays began to scream proximity warnings. Beyond the outer reaches of human space, a fleet emerged from slipstream so massive that even the Concorde's most jaded admirals stood paralyzed at the sight. These were not Terran vanguard ships. They were the war arcs of the Sistari. For centuries, the Concorde had considered the Shestari an enigma, an ancient species that rarely intervened in galactic affairs, whose colossal arc ships were said to house entire biospheres. They were neutral, isolationist, and now they were here. Shestari signals began flooding every frequency. The translation took only seconds. We stand with humanity. Withdraw your forces, or face extinction. It was a statement so blunt, so absolute, that for a few heartbeats no one spoke. Vorthill felt something loosen inside him, some final tether of certainty snapping under the weight of reality. Humans had not simply prepared a counteroffensive. They had secured an alliance with the most elusive power in known space. In a hidden command center beneath the Rockies, Cale watched the unfolding transmissions with a composure that bordered on grim satisfaction. Do you think they understand yet? His adjutant murmured. Cale's expression didn't change. They will. He turned to a secondary console where a live feed showed the Shestari fleet aligning into an impenetrable phalanx. Spire ships of living alloy shimmered with aurora-like fields, bioorganic hulls capable of regenerating from almost any damage, even a fully intact Concorde armada could not have faced this force without catastrophic losses. And now, scattered, demoralized, and blind, they had no chance at all. The first Shestari transmission to humanity had been short. We remember what you did during the Exarch Wars, We repay our debts. In the assembly, that message sparked pandemonium. Counselors screamed at one another over who had allowed humanity to survive long enough to become indispensable to the Shistari. Some demanded immediate withdrawal. Others raved that no retreat could be tolerated. In Vorthal's private mind, no argument mattered anymore. The Concord had always relied on psychological inevitability, a belief that no species would dare resist the combined weight of their fleets, their history, their myth. That belief was gone when the Shistari war arcs came within weapons range of the Concord formations pinned near Proxima Centauri. There was no ultimatum, no negotiation, only a single flash of impossible light as one of the arc ships discharged a superluminal lance. The nearest dreadnought vanished in a coruscating eruption that left nothing but cooling atoms. Afterward, silence reigned in the channels, an unspoken admission that the battle was over before it had begun. But Kale was not finished. He keyed in a final broadcast to every Concord ship. His voice was low, steady, but carried an edge of unyielding will. You believed our strength lay in our weapons, our numbers. You were wrong. Our strength has always been in our unity. You thought us divided. But no one divides a Deathworlder from their kin, and no one breaks the bonds forged in hardship. He paused, letting the words hang like a blade suspended above them all. This was never a contest of domination. It was a test of who could endure, who would adapt, who would outlast. Outside, the Shistari arcs maneuvered with the inevitability of a tide. Their weapons glimmered with dormant power, daring any Concord vessel to make a final suicidal gesture. No one did that in those long moments. As the Concord fleet held its collective breath, the final realization spread among them. This war had never been winnable, not against a species that had survived the most lethal ecosystem in known space. Not against a people who, when cornered, did not break but called forth allies more ancient and terrible than the Concord's proudest legends. And not against a warrior who, when denied a seat at the table, had decided instead to flip the entire table over. Vorthal's limbs went slack. Around him, his staff simply stared at the image of Earth on the holoscreens, as though seeing it for the first time. They had triggered a conflict that would echo through history as the day the Concord discovered it was mortal. The war was no longer about conquest. It was about survival. And in that moment, many of them finally understood. They would not survive it. In the pale dawn over Proxima Centauri's pale dwarf star, the Concord's last hope died. The Shistari war arcs formed an encircling bulwark that no weapon could pierce. Their hulls shimmered with rippling energy fields that twisted sensor scans into nonsense. Every Concord dreadnought caught inside that sphere of annihilation was trapped, too damaged to escape, too proud to surrender. High Admiral Vortal stared into the tactical holotable. His limbs were heavy, as though gravity itself had turned against him. All the centuries of unchallenged dominance had come down to this, the Concord's finest armada, reduced to a fleet of drifting carcasses waiting to be picked clean. A whisper passed among his crew, spoken in the hushed, reverent terror usually reserved for myth. The humans did this. Outside the illuminant purpose, the sky fractured in a constellation of engine burns. The Terran vanguard had arrived to finish what they started. Hundreds of ships, sleek destroyers, armored assault carriers, refitted freighters bristling with kinetic cannons accelerated toward the Concord perimeter. Behind them, the Shistari maintained their silence, content to watch the final act. In the hidden command bunker beneath Earth's Rocky Mountains, Commander Elias Kale studied the data streams with an expression like carved stone. Has the Concord issued any communication? He asked. None, his adjutant replied. No surrender protocols, no negotiation. Kale inclined his head just a fraction. Then we proceed. He tapped a single rune on his console. Across every Terran vessel, alert klaxons wailed. Weapon Locks engaged in synchronized arrays. Shields pulsed to full power. This was it. Aboard the Illuminant Purpose, Vorthal's mind raced in circles. He had spent lifetimes mastering strategy. He had memorized the histories of every Concord campaign. He had always believed in the same core truth. No matter how cunning the prey, overwhelming force would crush it in the end. Now, faced with the consequence of that arrogance, he felt something new, a sorrow so profound it hollowed him out from. Within, his comms officer looked up, mandibles trembling. "Orders, Admiral?" Vorthal's gaze swept the bridge. The tired, terrified faces of his crew stared back. He had no orders that could change what was coming. In orbit, the first Vanguard assault wings broke formation into attack vectors. Terran strike craft darted ahead, engines flaring blue-white. Heavily armed corvettes flanked them in escort. Each pilot moved with the eerie precision of a species forged in catastrophe. When the Concorde's perimeter batteries came online, it was too late. Kale's voice crackled across every channel. "Engage." The opening salvo was a symphony of annihilation. Railguns fired in throbbing bursts, slugging hypersonic penetrators through shattered Concorde hulls. Swarms of combat drones slipped past defensive grids and latched onto hulls, burning through plating with shaped charges. The Shistari watched in implacable silence as Terran ships poured their fury into the Concorde ranks. One by one, dreadnoughts died. The Emerald Clarity erupted in a silent explosion as its main reactor breached containment. The Spiral Vow tried to break orbit, only to be bracketed by Shistari lances. A column of incandescent energy carved it in half, spilling atmosphere and debris into the void. Strike craft roared past the Illuminant Purpose, their weapons carving deep scars into her flanks. Automated repair systems failed under the onslaught. Fire blossomed along the starboard spine. In the command dais, Vorthal's crew wept openly. Through it all, Kale's voice remained steady, implacable. "You came here believing you could unmake us. You believed your civilization's history entitled you to ours. This is the price of that arrogance." Another Concorde cruiser went dark, her lights extinguished in a final gasp. Vorhil sank to one knee. His limbs could no longer bear the weight of his own defeat. He thought of all the warnings, all the intelligence reports dismissed as propaganda. The whispers that humans were more than just another unruly frontier species. That they were something older, harder. Deathworlders. He finally understood. The battle raged on an execution. In all but name, Terran heavy cruisers advanced with methodical precision, targeting weapons emplacements and command nodes. The Concorde defenders fired until their magazines were empty, then tried to ram their attackers in futile last charges. Nothing worked. Humanity had fought for its survival since before it ever left its cradle. Every hardship had been a lesson. Every disaster an education. And now, with the Concorde's might arrayed against them, they had shown the final truth. There was no force in the galaxy that could make them kneel. Vorthal's gaze lifted to the last intact view screen. Earth shone there, distant and blue. For a heartbeat, he thought it beautiful. The Terran flagship surged forward, weapons blazing. The Illuminant Purpose shuddered under impact after impact. Fire spilled into the command deck. Vortal closed all four of his eyes and bowed his head. Final transmission crackled through the failing comms grid. "Your reign ends here." He opened his eyes in time to see the last barrage streaking toward him. And then, in a wash of white light and thunder, the Concorde's legacy was erased. Humanity stood alone among the wreckage, bloodied, unbowed, triumphant. And across 1,000 worlds, every species watched and understood why Deathworlders were feared. The war was over. Across the void, where once Concorde banners had flown with imperial arrogance, now drifted only silence and ruin. Orbiting the scorched remnants of the Illuminant Purpose, Earth's flagship, Resolute Dawn, hung like a sword above a defeated empire. Below, the wreckage of the final Concorde fleet glinted in the sun-twisted metal, and shattered pride scattered across space like an open wound. Kale stood on the command deck, gaze locked on the wreckage. The stars beyond were the same as before. But everything had changed. No cheers rang out. No songs of victory. Just the quiet hum of systems resetting to peacetime routines. The war hadn't ended in celebration, but revelation. Behind Kale, a quiet chime sounded. A diplomatic channel Concord encryption. Someone had survived. Accept it, he said without turning. The holographic form of Vorthal's second-in-command, Admiral Sale, flickered into view. She looked smaller now, diminished, as if the gravity of defeat had aged her entire being. She didn't speak immediately. When she finally did, her voice was low and solemn. "I don't come to bargain," she said, "only to understand." Kale turned to face her. "Understanding came too late for many of yours." She lowered her eyes. "Yes, it did." A long silence stretched between them, two warriors from opposing worlds, neither triumphant, neither broken. "Just changed. We believed unity made us strong," she said. "But it was a unity of arrogance. Yours was born of hardship, of pain, of struggle." Kale's voice was quiet. "Pain teaches. The void does not care for ideals, only resilience." She nodded slowly. "We saw you as wild, unpredictable, undisciplined, but you were never disorder. You were adaptation." He stepped forward, folding his arms behind his back. "You looked at our chaos and mistook it for weakness," he said. "But we were forged in storms, united not by convenience, but necessity. You never understood what desperation makes of. A people." Sale's hologram flickered, barely stable. "You have ended an empire. What will you do with the ashes?" Kale said nothing for a long moment. "Then, we rebuild. We guard, we remember." Outside the viewport, Earth's fleet shifted formation. No worlds were conquered, no territory seized. The humans weren't colonizers, they were defenders. Their message wasn't one of dominance, but warning. Across the galaxy, the shockwaves of the battle rippled. On a desert moon in the Seraph Belt, a cluster of young Trolley watched the aftermath on a grainy broadcast. Their elders had taught them that humans were dangerous, but distant. Now they stared in silence, awed by the truth. On a space station orbiting Kelvin 9, political leaders met in urgent sessions, tearing down centuries of policy that had ignored the Terran threat. No longer were humans dismissed as savage outliers. Now they were something else, a force of nature, a legend reborn. On the outer colonies of the Sari, ancient songs were sung again, tales of the Deathworlders who had once fought beside them. In wars forgotten by time, now those stories had a new verse. The debt was repaid, the bond unbroken. Even among the fractured remains of the Concord, survivors whispered of what had happened, not with hatred, but awe. The species they had sought to erase had faced them, outgunned, outnumbered, and still stood. But perhaps the most profound change came not in the halls of power or the databanks of the historians, but in the hearts of individuals. In the heart of the galaxy, a monument was erected, not by humans, but by neutral species who had watched in stunned reverence. It bore no weapons, no banners, only a single inscription, carved into obsidian stone. Here stood a people who would not yield. From the edge of extinction, they forged defiance into legend. Let all who gaze upon this remember, never deny a Deathworlder their place, for they will take it. On Earth, Kale walked alone beneath a gray sky. Snow drifted down onto the mountain complex that had once held the Terran command. The war rooms were silent now, the servers cool. The walls that once echoed with strategy now held only memory. He stopped at a small iron plaque embedded in stone. No names, no rank, just a message. For the denied, the fallen, and the forgotten, you were never voiceless. You were the roar. Behind us, He stood there for a long while. The war had changed everything. Humanity was no longer the ghost in the machine, the rumor whispered by smugglers and fringe warlords. Now they were myth made manifest. Not because they conquered, but because they endured. Not because they were the strongest, but because they never stopped getting back up. And that, above all, was the lesson. Even when denied a seat, when disrespected, when erased, they didn't ask again. They proved why the galaxy should never have denied them in the first place. As the snow fell and winds whispered through the trees, Kale turned away. Somewhere out there, another threat would rise. Another enemy would forget, and humanity would remember.